You've moved to New York. We're glad to have you after been working in the West for many years. You've also launched a blog that if people read it today, it's called racefiles.org. If people read it today, they would see a lot of discussion of anti-black racism. We've been talking about Asians, but you're focused a lot on lifting the oppression of African Americans. Why? Why has that been a priority for you for so long?
Well, lifting up the oppression faced by African Americans, I believe, is really critical to addressing the issue of race in general in the United States. And so I really see it as something that I have believed is important because I believe that my liberation is tied to the liberation of African Americans. I believe that the liberation of people of color in this country in general is tied to the liberation of African Americans and of all people of color. I see African Americans, or at least anti-black racism, as the fulcrum of white supremacy. So if whiteness is the lever, and white privilege is the lever, that anti-black racism is the thing that gives that lever power. You know, it's the rock underneath the...
Explain that historically. Why so?
Well, I believe that race in the United States is an idea that was constructed originally in order to justify the enslavement of African Americans or of Africans. And that historically we have, as a country, created a set of legal codes, created a constitution, created a federalist system, all in order to accommodate slavery. And in each generation as we did so, that we continue to build on this idea of African people, African descended people, as this permanent other, a threat, a group to be exploited, and have built an entire politics around that notion.
And what about the consequent implications for white people? You talked about being extended honorary white status. That's been extended to an awful lot of people, courtesy of the racial system you're talking about.
Well, sure. The consequences, I believe, are complicated for white people. We have to keep in mind, of course, that white people in the United States had it pretty good until about the 1840s, until about the end of slavery, really. White people in this country may have, in many cases, been poor, but they weren't exploited workers. They weren't working class people who had to, report to bosses. They were small landholders. They were small farmers. They were also offered land as a kind of a bribe. They were offered Indian land and were able to settle those lands. And so they at least had that. They were not alienated workers. Until the economy started to industrialize and slavery was abolished. And then white people reacted with fear to the notion that the value of their labor would be degraded by the fact that Africans had been freed. And so I think that reaction has caused white people to develop an idea about race and nation that conflates the two, that really limits our ability as a country to understand the real issues at stake when we talk about things like immigration, for example, or our economic policies vis-a-vis places like Mexico.
But that's two complicated things happening at once. Industrialization, taking people away from their land, alienating them from their labor, putting them up at each other's throats for wages, and the end of slavery. Two complicated things with an impact on working classes of multiple races, all happening at once. What do you think is the legacy of that for the possibility of creating some new economic relations, as people are constantly trying to do, and particularly, I think, right now?
Well, I think that we need to now deal with the fact that, for the most part, without perhaps being able to articulate it, white people in America view white privilege as something that has a real cash value. It's worth money. It has historically been worth money. Historically, you could sue someone for saying you were black if you weren't and get a cash settlement, but you couldn't do the opposite. You couldn't sue someone for saying if you were white if you weren't, because that would be considered to your advantage. So, there is this perception that there is a cash value associated with whiteness, and I think that that's what we see people fighting over when issues like affirmative action get put on the table. This notion that somehow by having that privilege eroded, that your economic status will instantly be affected by it. And so I think that that's one problem. I also think that we have another kind of problem. It's more of a social ideological problem. I think, that the history of vilifying people of color particularly Native Americans and African Americans, has had the intention of causing African Americans and Native Americans in particular to be viewed as less than human by white people, to, in other words, be dehumanized. But it had the opposite effect and really dehumanized white people in the sense that their understanding of what it means to be human is limited by race. You know, it's very difficult for people to see what are human needs if they're defined in terms of race. You know, we have much more in common than people would like to imagine, but we continually limit ourselves in understanding how we are to serve our society and to see how the various needs of different people in society, regardless of race, are connected to one another.
So we're frightened to advocate for more for human needs because they might go to other kinds of humans?
Yes, and very often it's the case that the fight back against the attempt to extend programs to serve human needs is a racist one, right? We hear about African American welfare queens, for example, as a justification for limiting AFDC and turning it into temporary aid for needy families, with a much more punitive program than what we had in place before, and one that provides fewer benefits. The notion was that black people were on the dole and having babies and setting up multiple welfare accounts and stealing money from our economy, when the reality was that nothing could have been further from the truth. But white people accepted that notion and moved on it as a voting bloc. And who are most of the people who are on welfare? They're white people.
So to end, we're reading a lot about the demographic changes in this country, and we're soon going to be, confusingly enough, a majority-minority country, meaning most Americans will soon be people of color. Are Americans frightened about this? Is this a media phenomenon, a real phenomenon? You've done a lot of research into the right. Are people stacking up guns?
Well, I do think people are stacking up guns, and I think that people are moving things like stand your ground laws, in part in reaction to this fear about these changes. We will soon be a majority-minority country, and I think that that has a certain generation of white people quite frightened. I don't think that it's necessarily the case that all white people are upset about it. I think that the younger you go, the less frightened people are. In fact, many younger white people embrace the change. But I think that there is a generation of older white people who are brought up with these ideas about what happens when you allow minorities to take power, who are quite concerned about it. And I think we see it reflected in our politics. I think we see it reflected in all of these incredibly racist anti-immigration laws. And we see it reflected in this tremendous concern about guns and about the notion of our black president perhaps plotting to take away your guns by hatching a conspiracy, and things like stand your ground laws, which really are kind of statement of people's fear about strangers, others, taking things away from you.